as another Games Week winds its way down, it so happens that my video schedule lines up, offering a good reason to check out some more of Australia's gaming past. Which means it's time to go for a deep cut with a look at Reach for the Stars, developed and published by SSG, the Strategic Studies Group. The version of it I'll be focusing on here is the second edition for the Commodore 64, released in 1985, as it just happens to be the copy which I own. But how do we actually start in looking at a game like this? Reach for the Stars is one of the earliest examples of what we now call the 4X strategy game, being developed for home computers. You may think that such an early game may not offer much, but as we'll see, I think it's quite an interesting one nonetheless. The goal is straightforward. You and up to 3 other players. Those can be played by physical friends or letting the AI take their place, take to space and aim to be victorious. From the opening screen, you've got 3 options. Play the game's tutorial, set up a new game, or load a game in progress from disk. The tutorial is a special scenario, and the goal of this is really to follow the steps presented in the game's cover and get to grips with how it works. If, like me, you started playing these strategic games on more advanced systems, you're probably going to struggle to understand it on your first few attempts, so the tutorial is very handy to understand how it all works. Patience is certainly a virtue should you want to try this one out, and we'll see that covered a little further along. After having a few shots of the tutorial and getting your head around the controls, it's finally time to start a real game of it. One of those things I was truly excited by when I was setting things up is just how many options you've got to tweak before the game starts. And not just by setting the number of players or the skills of the AI ones you add to the mix, but many, and I mean many, of its variables. There's plenty of conditions which you can add to mix things up, especially when you feel that you've mastered the base game. Now, admittedly, from the time I've spent with it so far, some of these are kind of a little over my head, but should you feel the base game has gotten stale, then these option screens are for you. And then it's time to start colonizing the stars. Unsurprisingly, you'll find Reach for the Stars is quite a slow burning experience. The default settings have the game run for 40 turns, and that might sound like a lot at first. I really found it went by incredibly fast. If you do think it's limiting, you can increase the number of turns a game will last for. You can also reduce them should you want that, but trust me, 40 is a sane default. And of course, if you do run a longer game and find yourself kind of concerned about not having enough time for it to run, well, there is the option to save your progress to disk, allowing you to continue your game at a later stage. Something, though I didn't use, I'm genuinely really appreciative for. Speaking of turns, let's talk about them now. Every odd-numbered turn starts with the production phase. This is about allocating your colony's resources between production and growing the planet, researching new technologies, and defending it. It's an important balancing act, and you really need to be careful, especially on the production side of things, because if your population grows too much, your colony's production will suffer because the populace starts revolting. When this happens, your only real option is to start shipping them off to colonize other worlds or use them as cannon fodder, but we'll all talk about that later. The research part of it is really about developing new ships for warfare. We'll talk a bit more about that later as well. And as for defenses, they are automatically accommodated for by default. If you do have a colony which just happens to be drawing attention from your rivals, it's probably a good idea to put some more resources in order to boost those defenses up. But also, making sure you've got plenty of warships holding station in orbit so they could serve as your first line of defense. When it does come to fleet management, you've got several things you can build. Explorer ships are your frontline scouts. These move from system to system pretty quickly, and are used to provide recon for identifying suitable systems for colonization, or showing what your hostile rivals are up against, so you can plan a conquest. Now, to facilitate colonization or conquest, you need transports, and these will take population from your colony in order to man them and use them to colonize or assault a planet. But finally, there's warships. You start out with the Mark 1 ship available, and they're cheap and are basically cannon fodder. You can get variants from Mark 1 to Mark 4, and each increasing level is stronger, capable of dealing out more damage, and will cost you a pretty penny. But to access those later levels, you need to allocate your resources to ship research. But as you use your colony's resources, you don't want to spend all of those resource points. If you have any left over, they go into a shared pool, which you can use in future turns or on other worlds. And personally, that's really important because I found building up as large a stock of these as possible was essential for helping out when you found a new colony to get it going ASAP. One of the things that's really important for colony management is building up what's called the social stat. Getting this above 40 lets the population grow, otherwise they'll wither on the vine. Now, once you've done the dirty for all your colonies, you've allocated all their resources, you go into the movement phase, and this is really just about issuing movement commands to your various ships and fleets. Though you could move explorers about individually, there is a very handy shortcut on offer. Pressing Ctrl X automatically programs them to move to a new system. It's really handy, especially when you're trying to find systems later on when you've mapped out most of the galaxy. For your other ships, you'll have to organize task forces to manage them. That's pretty easy, as the screen is relatively straightforward to use. But programming their destinations is not quite as straightforward. And so we'll talk about how the galaxy is laid out. In Reach for the Stars, this galaxy is mapped onto a hex grid, which is pretty much unsurprising when you think about it. And it wraps around on the edges to sort of be a spherical structure. But the downside of this is that you have a fairly limited view of it on screen. And so there's not many points for reference or being able to learn the lay of the land, or galaxy. You do have several ways to navigate it. The easiest is being able to jump directly to any system which you know the name of, which is handy for setting up rallying points prior to taking on a hostile world. Whether in movement or production phase, you can page between your various fleets or colonies, and that is the quickest way to visit each and make sure you've done what you've needed to do for them. And it's especially handy if you so happen to start a turn not near one of your existing fleets or colonies. The last option is scrolling the map a hex at a time. Yes, it's kind of tedious, but personally I found it rather helpful for just learning things, especially early on, and honestly, if you choose the advanced option which completely randomizes the galaxy layout, you're really going to want to use this so you can understand it. Once you've issued commands to all your fleets, you can now end your turn, and it's time for everyone else to have theirs and let their actions play out. When your next turn begins, before you can get to production or movement, combat will be the first thing to play out, at least if the actions of yourself or one of your rivals results in it. That could be fleet-to-fleet combat or a planetary assault. It is worth noting, and again, this probably isn't much of a surprise for a bunch of reasons, but both of these scenarios are purely about numbers. So, if you've got the larger fleet in a fleet versus fleet battle, you're going to come out the victor. But what about planetary assaults? If you find it's your colony world which is under attack, you really need to have a stronger defense fleet on hand. And obviously, if you're attacking a hostile colony, you better hope your fleet is the one which is strong enough to smash those defenses. So, combat as a result is very important. But sadly, it's not fun. Success here is really just about having the bigger numbers. There isn't any room for strategy, tactics, or planning here. Just get as many ships as possible together and attack at once and hope you just overwhelm what is out there. Conversely, if you're defending, make sure you've put as many resources as you can into the planetary defense grid, or as well as amassing a large enough fleet of warships to be that first line of defense. That's not to say combat isn't important though, because it, quite frankly, absolutely is. To actually win Reach for the Stars, you need to earn victory points, and these come in one of 4 areas: colony development, battle victories, planetary conquest, and planetary destruction. Points for colony development are earned by founding and maintaining colonies, developing them so they continue to provide more and more resources for your war effort. Battle victories are simply earned based on the classes of ships destroyed should you be victorious. The larger the ship, the more points you'll earn as a result. Now, planetary conquest, that's about earning them by capturing and holding enemy colonies. If you can maintain a sizable hold on one and keeping it as long as possible, you're going to have those sweet, sweet victory points rolling through. Unsurprisingly, earning points towards planetary destruction is done by completely and utterly obliterating any other hostile colony you encounter. When you complete the final turn of the game, these are all calculated to give you your final total. And obviously, the player who has the most is the most successful space warlord and takes the crown. I have to admit, when I started playing Reach for the Stars, I found it quite a tough game to get into. Part of that for me was just managing the information about how your fleets and colonies are progressing. Newer 4X strategy games really take advantage of the higher resolution displays offered on more powerful hardware, along with graphical interfaces which allow you to see more stuff on screen. With Reach for the Stars here, you need to jump between the gameplay view and the menus. There are 3 screens which you really need to be checking frequently. The first shows you your fleets. The second shows you all the star systems, whether they've been explored or not, and the states of the planets within them. The final one shows the current victory point tally for all the players in the game. And this is one of those things that really comes out of the constraints of the limited screen resolution of the C64, the amount of data to be juggled about at a time. But the one thing that I found really frustrating was that you can't jump to a system or a fleet directly from those screens. And it really didn't help with just getting my head around managing my growing empire. Or at least that was the case with my first few runs at the game. I guess it's not much of a surprise, but what really worked was something that was probably expected, at least back in the day. Taking plenty of notes, whether on paper or more accurately just notes on my other machine, capturing footage, or on my iPad. But when you take a step back and just think about it for a bit, this UI probably shouldn't be much of a surprise. Reach for the Stars is absolutely a pioneering game. And the thing I love about games like it, they're always going to try and reach a little further than they can pull off. So you'll find a few missteps in the developers' visions being brought to life. And so it's time to ask the really big question. Is Reach for the Stars worth playing today? Particularly this second edition of the game. The first thing I need to ask you, just how open are you to strategy games and slower paced experiences in general? Secondly, how comfortable are you with tolerating an eccentric interface like this? The game offers some serious depth here, especially for the standards of 1985. And the AI really gives you a good challenge. There's a lot to learn to be able to beat it in battle. I certainly didn't really manage to come anywhere near being victorious in any of my games I played of it. If you dig the concept, but find the UI and the screen layouts here a little too primitive, the first thing I'd say to check out is the third edition of the game, which was released a few years later in 1988, alongside 8-bit versions for the Commodore 64 and the Apple II. 16-bit systems, the Amiga, the PC, the Apple II GS, and the Macintosh all received enhanced graphical versions. They had the kind of graphical interface, though early, which is a little more advanced than what you got on an 8-bit system. And so it was a little easier to understand what really is going on here. Of course, should you decide to check it out, whether that newer third edition or this second one, I'd also hazard that you really, and I mean really, need to make sure you find the accompanying documentation to go with it. This, unsurprisingly, has a dense set of documentation. Not massively long, but it's fairly detailed for its size, and you will need it to get absolutely anywhere in trying to play it. But it is an important slice of Australian gaming history and for strategy gaming as a whole, and so I still think it's worth trying to weather through it and maybe giving it a shot if you're a fan of strategy games or war games or those more dense experiences. And with that, well, I don't really have much more to say than thank you very much for watching this video.